In this next little lecture, we'll look at the EEG, electroencephalogram, and brain waves and what they mean, and look at how in sleep there are different cycles and how there are different brain waves correlated with each stage of sleep. So we'll just do a quick review of that as well. So over 100 years ago, it was discovered that if you just put an electrode on the scalp, you can actually detect little changes in voltage in the skin. And curiously, those voltage changes actually correlate with underlying brain activity. So the sum total of millions of nerve impulses in the brain, all those action potentials, at any given moment create these brain waves. So through what is called the electroencephalogram, EEG, you see a person here to the right with EEG electrodes all over the scalp. And these electrodes are usually affixed to the skin via a special electrolytic conducting gel. But it allows them to sense these very subtle electrical changes, voltage changes in the skin, which again correlates with the underlying brain activity. So from the electroencephalogram, we actually map out tracings from each one of these little electrodes, and we can look at characteristic brain rhythms. So it turns out if you map out those brain waves, and each one of these electrodes depicted in this diagram would have its own little tracing. So if you look at a typical EEG recording, there's usually dozens of little traces on that EEG. And what this allows us to look at is the electrical activity that's underlying in that particular region. And so it's giving us a pretty good estimate of what's happening specifically in the cerebral cortex underlying that region of scalp. And that can be very helpful for diagnostic purposes. For example, in epilepsy, seizure activity, we have uncontrolled neuronal activity, and that gives very, very characteristic readings on the EEG. So EEGs can be very helpful for looking for seizures and seizure activity. It can also look for a whole host of other abnormalities. It can be used even to confirm that brain death has occurred. So when there's no EEG tracing, that correlates with brain death. I think it's very interesting that in Chinese medicine there is a whole field of scalp acupuncture, and the idea is that by needling portions of the scalp, you can actually influence underlying brain regions. So for example, influence the circulation going to different parts of the brain after a stroke. And that's almost like the reverse of what the EEG is. So I think the fact that we have this EEG phenomena kind of opens up the door to saying, well, can you send the information the other way? Can you needle the scalp or put electrical currents on the scalp? And can that influence underlying brain regions? So I think that opens up the door to more research on scalp acupuncture. There is another technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where basically very powerful magnetic fields are generated outside the skull, and they penetrate deeply to different parts of the brain, and they are changing in time. And whenever you have a changing magnetic field, that will cause a electrical current to be set up in, let's say, an ionic solution or in the neuron. So one way of actually influencing neurons is to pulse them with these very strong magnetic fields. So that's called TMS. And TMS is now being used for a whole variety. It's being explored for recalcitrant depression, for all sorts of movement disorders, for potentially dementia, all these different things. So I think there's a lot of really interesting electrophysiology that's going on here, and that we can utilize clinically. All right, so let's look at the four basic types of brain waves. They're really categorized based on frequency. So all these brain waves are changing in time, and you get these sort of sinusoidal-like waves. They have different frequencies. So the brain waves that we see associated with people when they are awake and alert and focused on some activity, this is called beta brain waves. And these are between 14 and 30 hertz. Remember, hertz is cycles per second. So this is these are 14 to 30 cycles per second. So these are very fast brain waves. And higher levels in the high beta is usually associated more with anxiety and activation of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So think of beta is more very alert, concentrated, you're sort of in the world, you're in your fight or flight response to some degree, and so forth. Now as you relax, let's say you go home after a stressful day, and you light a candle or you sit and you start reading a book and you start relaxing, then what you can measure typically are what are called alpha waves. And these are between 8 and just under 14 hertz. So this is associated with relaxation. These are the brainwave. This is the brainwave state you need to induce to really ensure good memory function. So we find that memory really doesn't work well when you're in beta. But when you're in alpha, this is when people have heightened learning, heightened capacity to learn and memorize, increased serotonin production. We can think of it as a pre-sleep kind of brain rhythm, and it's often activated at the beginning of meditation practices. So when people get into the first layer of relaxation and meditation, that's typically correlated with alpha waves. And again, the EEG electrodes, depending on where they are in the scalp, would be detecting these. And you can have some parts of the brain that are more in beta, some that are more in alpha. But usually with time, like in meditation or relaxation, the whole brain will now switch over into alpha rhythms. And notice that in alpha, the amplitude of the waves, so that's the height of the wave, and that correlates with the strength of the voltage that's being measured on the skin. The amplitude is higher than in beta. So beta waves are typically very chaotic, disorganized, of low amplitude. Alpha waves are more, you see there's more of an organization with the waves, and there's higher amplitude. Now, if we get even more relaxed, and most people will fall asleep in this state, but experienced meditators can actually retain alertness and consciousness in this state, we reach theta. And theta rhythms are between 4 and just under 8 hertz. And notice they have very large amplitude, and again, more organized even than alpha in a sense. So we think this is really involved in dreaming sleep. So we see theta rhythms to some degree in REM sleep, but also entering into what we call slow wave sleep, where we actually, if you wake people up in that slow wave sleep, and I'll talk about that here in a moment, most people think they're not dreaming, whereas in REM sleep, they would report that they're dreaming. So we usually associate REM with dream sleep. But we think the theta rhythms are necessary for integrating information, for increasing retention of learned material. So when people fall asleep and they listen to recordings of languages and things like that, interestingly, it's been shown that when they wake up and they're tested on that material, they have better retention. So in a way, theta has this sort of integrative function. Again, we can reach this in deep meditation and deep trance inner imagery. And when we get into theta, we start to see that you flip out of your sympathetic nervous system and really go into more of a parasympathetic response. And we see healing happening in the body. So one of the things we think acupuncture is related with is switching people from sympathetic to parasympathetic mode. And one thing I haven't seen very much of is brainwave studies looking at what happens to people's brainwaves. But my guess is they flip from beta to alpha, and then they might even go down to theta rhythms in deep acupuncture sessions. And then finally, the slowest brain rhythms are delta rhythms, and they're between 0.1 and just under 4 hertz. And this is usually associated with dreamless sleep. We also call this slow wave sleep, SWS. And these are very high amplitude. And what we find in delta is that big areas of the brain are now working harmoniously. They're actually integrative. Whereas in beta, it's like each little brain area, each association area, and the motor and sensory areas are all working independently. And so they all are kind of scrambling for attention. But in theta, we have this mass integration of all brain function. In delta. In delta, we also see that the neurons actually shrink a little bit, and cerebral spinal fluid now can wash through the brain. And so this is a very important brain rhythm to get into for proper healing, rejuvenation, regeneration of the brain, cleaning out toxic waste products and so forth. Some experienced meditators can stay awake in delta rhythms, and this again is associated with a very strong healing response in the body. In fact, the growth hormone, which is again secreted from the pituitary gland, growth hormone is not secreted in large amounts in adults except during delta rhythm sleep. So when you're in slow wave sleep or delta rhythm sleep, that's where the growth hormone is secreted. And growth hormone has all sorts of protective roles on the body when it's secreted physiologically. We also secrete large levels of hormones like DHEA, which is a steroid from your adrenal glands, which is an anabolic steroid, and it actually helps to regenerate muscle and ligaments and bone and so forth. So delta rhythms are really your healing rhythm. When you get people into delta brainwave states, we get down in there. I think it's interesting how, we have so much information now about the correlation of brainwave states and healing, and yet it's not really applied very much in the conventional circles. A lot of times, if you look at, for example, how, if you go to the hospital or an ER, it's like everybody's in beta brainwaves. They're running around, panicking, screaming. It's just alarms everywhere. And so, in a way, there's no healing that happens in that case. It's only when you get into this relaxed setting. And we're now seeing, taking the examples of hospitals, we're now seeing that hospital designers are taking this into consideration, finding that when people have a window to look out of, or if they look onto a green space, etc., that actually improves healing times. It decreases the amount of pain medication that's needed, etc., etc. Obviously, increasing nutrition would be important too, but that's unfortunately still not done very widely. So these are the 4 categories of brainwave patterns, and just know a little bit about which rhythm correlates with what. I'll just mention one more thing, and that is that the Earth's magnetic field, if you look at the surface of the Earth in the ionosphere, which is a layer of ions up in the upper atmosphere, and that's where a lot of this electrical phenomena comes from. There is a constant rhythm between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, and it actually has its own frequency. It's called the Schumann Resonance, and it's actually set up by lightning strikes between the Earth and the clouds, and the lightning actually causes this chamber between the ionosphere and the Earth to resonate at around 7 hertz. So it's right at actually just over 7 hertz, right around that theta frequency. So we can say the Earth is actually attuned to bringing us naturally into theta. And interestingly, there's one hypothesis that a lot of these, if you go, for example, through Northern Europe and Ireland and so forth, you see these stone cairns. They're very ancient. They were sort of set up with these big blocks of stone. And it was thought that they were graves at one time or so forth. But another hypothesis is that if you go inside of those cairns, the Schumann resonance, the magnetic field, is amplified, and that would entrain you, if you were in meditation, entrain you to that frequency. And when you're in that frequency, now you have access to different states of consciousness. You're getting into theta brainwaves and maybe even deeper into delta, and you can get all sorts of new insights. So really interesting studies on brainwaves and how they impact health and how they are related to our different states of consciousness. So I mentioned during sleep there are different brainwave states that occur. So let's just look at the typical sleep cycle. So when you're awake, you're typically in beta brainwaves. So these are the more quick frequencies, 14 up to 30 hertz. I should mention there is actually a 5th brainwave state above 30 hertz. These are called gamma rhythms. And gamma, people get into bursts of gamma when they're under very high stress or are very focused. So we see that, for example, in pilots who maybe are in a very stressful landing situation or something. They have these bursts of gamma that come out in their EEGs. So that's a 5th one, but we usually talk about the 4 that I just reviewed. But in awake brainwave states, we're in beta. And then as we relax, we start to go down into what's called stage 1 and stage 2 sleep. And there are very specific characteristic changes you can see on the EEG called sleep spindles and K complexes. I won't go into those here. But you're getting now down into alpha rhythms. And then sinking down, we're now getting into going down to the theta rhythms and delta rhythms. So deepest sleep, slow stage 4 sleep. The current sort of system now actually combines stage 3 and stage 4 into slow wave sleep. But basically that is getting from theta down to delta. So here you're in delta. And notice this takes about 30 minutes or so, just under an hour in some cases, to go from waking to delta. And then you stay in delta for maybe 15 minutes. And it's in delta you secrete growth hormone, you secrete these anabolic steroids, your brain washes itself with cerebrospinal fluid, you regenerate. But if you wake most people up in this stage, in delta, they'd say they don't remember dreaming. They don't. It's almost like they were in some other dimension, just not remembering dreaming at all. And then, interestingly, during sleep, you come back up after about 15-20 minutes from delta, back up to theta, back up to low alpha, and even beta in REM sleep. And if you wake people up in REM, they usually say they've been dreaming. So in REM sleep, what's interesting is that your brainstem, remember, there is that sleep inhibition center. The brainstem paralyzes all the motor, descending motor activity from the cortex. And so basically your muscles and your body don't move, but your eyes still do, and they are darting back and forth. So that's why we call it rapid eye movement sleep. And interestingly, your sympathetic nervous system is activated to some degree during REM sleep. So this is not necessarily a physiologic healing phase. Your body is not regenerating that much in REM, but we do think REM is important for consolidating memories and what you learned the day before and working through different patterns and so forth. So there's a psychological aspect to REM. And then you stay in REM for, again, maybe 15 to 30 minutes, and then you slip back down again into delta, and you stay there for, again, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and you come back up to REM. And notice as the night goes on, you don't actually get down to delta. Maybe you stick into theta, and then you come back up to REM again. Then you stick into maybe just low alpha, and then REM, and then you wake up. So we usually go through 4 or 5 of these cycles a night. Usually the first 1 or 2, we get into slow wave sleep. And if you go to bed before midnight, usually even earlier, 10 p.m. for example, you're going to get into that state a lot more quickly, and you might have at least 2 cycles that you go through. Each cycle is about 90 minutes. So we stay 90 minutes in a single cycle. So most people go through a total of 4 to 5 per night. Now, there's a lot of variation here depending on what medications you might be on, things like that. We know that, for example, certain things that people have taken for sleep, which are no longer recommended for sleep, like benzodiazepines, Ativan, Xanax, those kind of medications, they actually obliterate slow wave sleep. And so you never get down into these deep rhythms. And they can really mess up with REM sleep as well, so you don't get the psychological healing aspect either of sleep. So we don't recommend those anymore for sleep. Other agents, we know a lot of herbal agents, things like L-theanine, and that's a amino acid, and then herbs like passion flower and valerian and things like this, they seem to augment slow wave sleep so we can get down there faster. Okay, so that's a little bit about the sleep cycles. Here you just see a graph of the different parts of the sleep. So we see awake, and then non-REM sleep, which would include stage 1, 2, and then the slow wave, stage 3 and 4, and then REM sleep. So notice in REM, again, the brain waves look very much like beta. This is awake state. Here's stage 1. Again, stage 1 and REM look very similar. Stage 2, we're getting higher amplitude, slower rhythms, and then finally we're slowing down to theta and then delta. Think delta deepest, delta rhythms down here in slow wave sleep. So that's the typical changes on EEG that you see. Now, for people that have problems with sleep, we can refer them for a sleep study. And what they do there is you spend the night at the clinic. They actually put an EEG helmet on you, the hat, and they collect all this data. And they also look at things like your blood pressure and your breathing rhythms. They can tell if you have sleep apnea. We'll talk about that later. But in particular, they can tell if your brain waves, if you're actually getting into the different stages of sleep appropriately. So sleep studies can be helpful in many cases when people have severely disturbed sleep that's not responding to the usual kind of therapies. All right, so that's just a little bit on brain waves and sleep rhythms. In our final little video in this series, we'll look at cranial nerves.